Welcome to Immortal Works Flash Fiction Friday, Episode 27, The Hand, by Holli Anderson, read by John Grundvig. He'd blamed her. He'd blamed her since the day it happened, and it destroyed their marriage. Picking up the repulsive hook contraption that was meant to replace his amputated hand, he hurled it and watched with quiet rage as it ripped a new hole in the wall of the pitiful studio apartment he couldn't afford. The love he had for her was still there, buried deep beneath the self-loathing and disgust that boiled over each and every time he looked at the hideous stump where his talented left hand had been before the accident. "I work around some dangerous equipment," he'd told her. "I promise I'll put my ring back on right after work." She'd cried. Not the hysterical, dramatic crying of a woman just vying for attention, but the quiet tears sliding down the cheeks of someone who was truly hurt. "I would never remove my wedding ring," she'd said. "Not for any reason." So he left the stupid ring on. For her. And just as he'd warned her could happen, the big machine caught the ring when he was feeding a sheet of metal into it. It pulled his hand in and punched it along with the metal he'd been cutting. Complete amputation. "Ah!" he screamed, pulling at his hair with his remaining hand. He ripped a cushion from the couch and flung it at the guitar case that taunted him from the corner of the tiny room. "My last week working at that hellhole. My last week." He said this aloud to himself. He'd been talking to himself more and more lately. Well, there's no one else to talk to. Everyone took off like bats out of hell when they realized I wouldn't be playing lead guitar for the Encrypted. A tear slid down his cheek and he laid his head against the back of the couch. Everyone except her. Hannah stayed. She stayed until I drove her away. It was her fault. This was all her fault, and he shouldn't feel a lick of guilt for destroying what they had. He sighed heavily and forced himself to get off the couch. Dr. Walker would expect him to be his usual cheery, fake self. He retrieved the hook from the floor and strapped it on with the fluidity of something long practiced. "How are you really doing, Jackson?" Dr. Walker stared into his eyes. The doctor had finished his exam, proclaiming that the disgusting stump was doing well. He'd been surprised that the new prosthetic hook hadn't rubbed any sores into Jackson's skin. "I'm fine. Seriously. You just gotta take what life gives you, you know?" Jackson lied. His doctor pushed back on his rolling stool as he continued to stare into his patient's eyes. He smiled a little and nodded. "You have such a great attitude about all of this, especially considering everything you lost." Jackson looked down, unable to keep up the facade much longer. "Yeah, well, being a member of a top 10 rock band probably wouldn't have been that great anyway. You know, with all the adoring fans, the money, the travel, the money." He tried to laugh, but it came out more as a series of small grunts. "Well, Jackson, I have a proposition for you." Dr. Walker leaned forward on the exam stool. "We've been working on something here at the university that I think you're a prime candidate for." "No offense, Doc, but I'm really not interested in any new prosthetics. None of them will allow me to play guitar again." The doctor's eyes sparkled as he smiled up at Jackson where he sat on the exam table. "That's exactly what I'm offering you. The chance to play again." Jackson awoke slowly from the anesthesia, small clips of conversation getting through his half-dream state. "Surgery went well." "Took longer than anticipated. The neurosurgeon, attaching the donor neurons." "Do you think it'll work?" Jackson forced his eyes open and drew in some deep breaths, smelling the stale odor of the plastic tubing blowing oxygen into his nose. He raised his head from the pillow and looked down at the bandages wrapped around his lower arm. And the hand. It was still too new to refer to as his. In fact, he didn't think he'd ever be able to think of it like that. The idea of having a dead guy's body part sewn to him just plain grossed him out. Even the idea that he might be able to play his guitar again almost hadn't been enough to convince him to go through with it after the doctors explained the procedure. The hand wasn't all he got from the dead guy. He got small parts of his brain, too. so the hand would respond immediately to the commands of the brain. They connected the dead guy's neurons with Jackson's, meshing everything together with a couple of computer chips and fiber optics. Trying to wrap his mind around the whole thing had given him a headache and made him a little sick to his stomach to boot, so he'd finally just said screw it and consented to the surgery, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Moths and other flying insects buzzed around the porch light as Jackson hesitated. What am I doing here? He half turned to go back to his car when his left hand, his new hand, reached out and pounded on the screen door. He whipped around, mouth open, staring at the hand that had acted of its own accord. The sound of the TV reached him as she opened the door. "Jackson!" She paused. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't angry, just confused. "Han..." It sounded weird to use the nickname he'd used throughout their courtship and marriage. "Hannah, I wanted to show you something." She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter, flipping the light switch on to illuminate the darkened room. "This is a surprise, Jackson. You've been ignoring my calls and texts ever since the divorce." He looked down. Not knowing what to say, he pulled his hand and the other hand out of the pockets of his jacket and held them out to her, palms up. Sucking in a breath, Hannah asked, "How?" Instead of explaining the procedure, Jackson simply said, "I can play again." They talked late into the night. He left her house with a genuine smile on his face. That night, he had the first of the nightmares. Awakening in a cold sweat, all he remembered of the dream was the hand holding a knife, blood everywhere, and screams. He remembered the screams. Mostly it repulsed him, but some small part of him found it exhilarating. He and Hannah met for lunch a few days later. Her soft voice and laughter made his heart beat faster and stronger. Smiling at something she said, he tried to reach for a soda with the hand. Confused, he looked down at it. The hand held a steak knife. Fists balled around the handle as it crept across the table toward Hannah. Jackson clenched his jaws and concentrated on letting go of the knife. The hand trembled before finally releasing its grip. "I have to go." He pushed the chair out and stood, making no excuse for his abrupt departure. "Dr. Walker, this is Jackson." He paced as he held the phone to his ear. "Some weird stuff is going on with this hand. You have to tell me where it came from. Whose hand is this?" "Why don't you come in for a visit? We can discuss it in my office." "No, tell me now." The doctor was silent for several seconds before answering quietly. "It came from a prisoner. A serial killer who wanted to do something to make up for his crimes by donating his body to science." Hannah had her back to him, washing the vegetables in the sink. The hand reached for the large butcher knife she just used to cut up the chicken. Teeth grinding, he willed the hand to drop it. The hand shook, but continued toward her. "Hannah!" Jackson choked out a warning. "No!" The knife sliced cleanly into her neck. Her hands flew up to the gaping wound and she gurgled, trying to take a breath before she fell to the floor. Covered in her blood, he stumbled to the garage. He fought the hand with his mind and with the strength of his right hand finally wrestled it into the vise. He yelled out in pain as he tightened it around the foreign body part attached to him. Jackson's screams could be heard 3 houses down as he cut through his own flesh with the hacksaw. Laying in the high-security hospital bed, guards just outside his door, he thought, "It's gone. I got rid of it. Of him." His eyes closed, the pain medication finally kicking in. They flew open again as laughter, not his own, sounded in his head. "The hand is gone, but I'm still here. Let's get out of this place and go have some fun." Thanks for listening to Immortal Works Flash Fiction Friday. If you have a submission, please send it to submissions@immortal-works.com.